Today we have a great guest. He reached out to me. He's been a listener of our program, A Neighbor's Choice, and he's also been going over to Ukraine to help with humanitarian missions and opportunities to alleviate the cost of war and what goes on there. And so I wanted to have him on because he has a new book that he just published himself. But we have with us Ryan Miller. How you doing, Ryan?
David, I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. Now you joining us from Texas, correct? Is that right?
Yes, sir. And I gotta say, I'm ecstatic to be on your show. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Now, you had reached out about your book title. Could you hold up your book title? We could see that because I
Absolutely.
thought it was an interesting topic. On A Neighbor's Choice, we like to explore, the human element. Okay, it's called the Volunteers War. For those who are listening on the podcast audio program, it's called The Volunteers War by Ryan Miller, a firsthand account of the Russia-Ukraine War. Forward written by Charles Hammerton. Now, it's a beautiful title. I love the colors and everything. But now, what's interesting about this is that you've kind of encountered a growing understanding of faith in your experience on the ground in the horrors of war. And that's something that we like to focus on this program, this show, A Neighbor's Choice. That's why we put the word neighbor, right? And the choices that we make have huge consequences. Even when we think about the ones who are the masters of war, okay, those are our neighbors, and they choose to send us into war, right? Ultimately they're our neighbor as it relates to God, right? They have to stand before God just like all of us. And
Mhm.
so in that way, even though they have an external position beyond our, social milieu or whatever, they still are a neighbor. And one of the reasons why it's important to have that is because oftentimes politics functions as a kind of scapegoat diversion device where oh, it's that guy, that's the dastardly one, but that's scapegoating them as if you were given that level of power, you wouldn't be tempted to do similar behaviors, right? That could be evil as well. And that's why it's important to always look at even people who do horrible, heinous things as neighbors, because that helps us see what we could be capable of doing and therefore understand the structures in place that incentivize wickedness in high places, right? So,
Yes.
Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background before you got interested in going over to Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, my background is it's pretty simple, man. I was in the oil field for a few years. I did the army for 4 years. Yeah, I went to college at Texas Tech. Um, that kind of thing. Whenever I went over to Ukraine in 2022, I'd been living in Dallas, and it took me all of 1 week to figure out I could not stand Dallas. And so, as far as I was concerned, Ukraine was a big upgrade from that for sure.
Yeah,
But originally, I'm from New Mexico, eastern New Mexico, out in the oil patch out there. Now I'm located in Lubbock, Texas.
yeah, okay. And now you first went to Ukraine in what year?
2019 was the
2019.
first time.
You were a correspondent, right?
Yes, sir.
So tell
Yeah.
us, what does that involve and why did you want to go over there?
Yeah, well, I initially wanted to go over there. Honestly, man, the Holy Spirit just kind of put something on my soul. So I had just started my freshman year in college after the army. I was assigned to write a paper about the Ukraine war, the civil war going on over there, and just got obsessed, man. I don't know how else to explain it other than that, and knew I needed to go. So I set up an LLC, um, convinced a buddy to go with me, and we embedded with the Donbass battalion over there in near Popasnaya, Ukraine. So that's not far from Bakhmut. That's about 10 miles east of Bakhmut, Ukraine. And I'm sure that y'all have heard of that place. It's been a
Yeah.
big topic in the news about the war. Spent a lot of time in Bakhmut. It used to be a very, very beautiful city. Um, but yeah, even it was just a series of coincidences, man. Even learning the Russian language, it was like I had signed up for Chinese in Texas Tech, but there was a big systemic mistake, and they took me out of all my classes and put me back in all of my classes except for Chinese and put me in Russian instead.
Wow.
So I just happened to learn the language before I went anyways. And yeah, so that's kind of what inspired me to go the first time.
Wow. And so you were wanting to cover it, and did you do live streams or videotapes, or what did you do?
Not really. I took a bunch of pictures and videos over there. I wrote a few things on it, but never really did a whole lot with it, to be honest with you, because I wanted to be kind of a journalist because I have a problem with how journalism is done most of the time. But the main thing was for some reason I just felt like I had to go. I had to get there specifically.
Yeah.
And 3 years later, as it turns out, that ended up being a pretty crucial thing for what we would end up doing, for sure.
Yeah. So 3 years later, 2022, you decided to go back, right?
Right,
Okay.
right.
That was your second time being over in Ukraine.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that would have been in early March 2022. Um,
Is that right when the Russians came in, or I don't remember the timeline? Is that February or March they did that?
yeah, they came in on February 24th,
Okay.
2022. I think I got there to Poland maybe on March 4th, something like that. Um, and that was one of those things where it was like there's all this stuff going on in Syria, Sudan, the Congo, Burma, all these places, but um, in Ukraine, that was a place where I already had experience. I had a broad network of people across the country, spoke the language, so I thought, okay, there might be actually something that I can do there. So bought a plane ticket and went, and only by the grace of God and people who were giving me money to do it, right? So it 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 ended up working out pretty well on that front, at least.
And you were embedded what side, on the Ukrainian side or the Russian side, or how does that work?
The Ukrainian side. So in
Yeah.
2019, I was embedded as a journalist with the Ukrainians, and in 2022, I wasn't really rolling around the Russian side of the lines, right? I was staying mostly on the Ukrainian side, um, just for the self-preservation mostly.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
why did you want to go back there? Was there something? What was it about that conflict that you? What value did you believe you could add to the situation?
I had no clear-cut vision whenever I went in 2022. It was again just something that I knew I was being called to do. And so my theory was I'll just go and I'll get in where I fit in and see what happens.
Yeah.
Initially I thought that I was going to go and join their foreign legion because I'm an American from the cowboy states and your initial instinct is to pick up a gun, but that ended up not being the route that I was called to do, thank God.
Yeah. Could you give us your introduction on the book about what you think
Yes.
motivated the war here?
Yeah, so the first line, it's not all political rants through the book, but the first line in the introduction is the American government went out of their way to start this war for years. This war is what they wanted. If you want to skip this entire book, know this one thing. They will continue to do this unless we, the people, put a stop to it.
Now, did you discover that prior? Like, when did you discover that realization of, or
Yeah, it would have been in that second trip in March. I
because you were about to go on fight against, you were about to kind of help facilitate
yeah.
what you said was what America wanted, which is a conflict, right? At
Yeah,
first.
and at that time you can read in there. The book is just a bunch of my journal entries that I wrote
Yeah.
over there, and so like you can read in there a couple of rants where it's I didn't exactly feel that this was the war they wanted at that time, but I
Hmm.
definitely felt that they were being reckless enough and not caring if they started a war, and that was being generous. That was a generous estimation.
Who's they? You're talking about America or?
Yeah, America. Yeah, so our State Department, DoD, all these NATO. You know what I mean? All these guys
Mhm.
for sure.
And so that was just, uh, was that what started turning your mind? Were you looking at just local realities, or like hearing what the people of Ukraine said, or just watching the news like everybody else, but just being there locally too, or what? What was the
Well,
realization?
well, yeah. So it was all of that. It was reading the reports. It was looking at the media reporting on it. Anytime that you have Fox and CNN, the two opposite ends of the spectrum of our propaganda news networks, agreeing on a thing, you should be very, very skeptical about it. And I saw them agreeing on this thing entirely and thought, that's weird. We should probably question this a little bit. Watching the political rhetoric about it and just their actions, man. I mean, basically they were promising unconditional support. That's a little bit odd. They put sanctions on Russia as if Russia had not prepared for sanctions. They were trying to cancel everyone and everything Russian, and I thought right off the bat, not only is that weird, it just seems incorrect. That just seems incorrect. So even though I was there, I wasn't there for them.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? I was there for the people
yeah,
that needed help, because at the end of the day, it's the poor and middle class and your everyday people that are gonna bear the weight of
yeah,
these kinds of things. And that's exactly what I found.
yeah. I mean, that's the reality is that you, even though you don't, you kind of concluded that America wanted this war, you're not picking any side here because the reality of war is a sacrifice on the poor and the middle class primarily, right?
Yeah, well, not exactly. I'm definitely on a side. At that time, I would have said that I was on the side of humanity. Now I would say I was on the side of Christ, which is usually pretty aligned with your your humanitarian efforts. But yes, absolutely, I was on his side, just not on the side of a nation state. That's not where my loyalties lie.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
what did you see there? Tell us. Do you have like two or three journal entries that you could reference, or you can recall a story or two or three that kind of give us a snapshot into what you experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the beginning of the war, I was mostly in Poland,
Yeah.
right? We were on the border with Ukraine, and we were doing all kinds of things every day. So one of the things that the groups I was doing, that I was running around with, was doing was combating sex trafficking, that kind of thing. This was a huge problem at the start of the war. There wasn't enough police to kind of quell that initiative by the bad guys. They ended up having to ship police in from all over the country to do that. But initially, there just wasn't enough manpower. So what we would do is take the cops that were already there and either report these guys or bring them to them. You could always spot them because they'd be hanging out on both sides of the border, taking pictures of women and children who are very stressed, tired, and distraught, and offering them rides. Right, and I'm sure a lot of guys out there offering rides were very perfectly fine gentlemen that were just trying to do a good thing. But a lot of these women and children, we suspect, were getting in these cars and never being heard from again. Right, and
And these sex
so that
traffickers showed up as soon as the war started. They're
yeah, it presented a great opportunity for them, because not only are these women and children and elderly so distraught, stressed out, and tired, but all the men were left back in Ukraine. So there's no one to defend them other than, your police and your volunteers that were willing to do something about that. Another thing we did, man, was just running supplies across the border. We were handing out blankets and water and all kinds of stuff to people in line. We were bringing supplies, medical supplies into the country, running them in on ambulances, that sort of thing. At night, I would work in the clinic in the refugee camp, sorting out medicines and that sort of thing. So I've
that was
got.
in Poland. That was in
I was in
Poland.
Poland.
Yeah,
I was in Poland, yes, sir.
yeah.
And I've got a an entry here from the book, and just be forewarned, I wrote this for me, so I think it's really funny. I try to tie a lot of humor in there, and I can read off a list of just like one 24-hour period in the beginning of the war if you'd like.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so let me give you a rundown of just the last 24 hours. I, along with my groups, sorted foreign medicines, took blankets across the border, handed some dickers over to the police, carried 4 cats into Poland and got held up by customs, took a man to the veterinarian for a stray dog bite to the face, took a man to the medical tent for a stray dog bite to the face, took the man to the hospital for a rabies shot for a stray dog bite to the face, took the man back to the ops room and named him Dogman or Wolfman. We're still deciding on which for the stray dog bites to the face. We took medical and military aid across the walking border and then over to Lviv, Ukraine. Got on a Latvian sex traffickers naughty list. Something about George, who knows who he is. Sorted foreign medicines. Met a super cute redheaded gal of some nationality who seemed to fancy me. It was mutual. Found out the super cute gal had a boyfriend, which is when I stopped fancying her. Um, Finally got out of customs after being held up for the four cats. Delivered the cats and an old Ukrainian lady to her German husband. Saw a chicken, saw Santa Claus, clucked at the chicken man, ho ho ho, Santa Claus. Earned the name Blanket Man, earned the name Wet Blanket. Interpreted a lot of Russian into English. Trolled a bunch of news reporters, helped Ukrainian women and children carry their bags, and hung up signs in Ukrainian telling people not to go with anyone except official buses, which also have directions to the official buses, right? So um, there was just so much going on in any given day in that time period. It was actually really shocking um, because across that walking border in Medica, there was probably a half mile of just like ramshackle tents lining that entire walking border. And you could find everything from free SIM cards, free food, medical assistance. There were firefighters there. There were guys waiting to go into Ukraine to volunteer for the Foreign Legion there, right? It was really like the Wild West. When I went back in June of 2022, all of it was gone, which was insane, which meant that the refugee crisis was more or less over, or at least the mass influx of people from Ukraine had more or less stopped.
Mm-hmm. So,
Mm.
so what did you do when you came back in June? You did something different?
Yeah, so some of the people that I had met in March called me up to do a few jobs. Basically, we had been picked up to handle special supply missions, and that's what we ended up doing in June, July, and August of 2022.
And what does that mean? Special supplies.
Yeah, it means moving stuff around in a discreet way, humanitarian aid, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we had passenger buses that we had rigged out to basically look like they're carrying passengers maybe, but really we're carrying boxes of food, water, Coca-Cola, chips, that kind of thing, medical supplies, all of this stuff across the country. The way that a lot of this aid had been delivered across Ukraine up until this point was either in small like personal vehicles like SUVs and sedans, stuff like that, or in big rig like obvious stuff haulers, right? And that's really really great. But with the stuff haulers, you had a problem with a lot of this stuff, you know, going missing, or not enough of it was able to be shipped at any given time, and especially that applied to the east. So a lot of the time when you got over into like Kharkiv and the Donbass, the only stuff that was reaching them was stuff that you could fit in these personal vehicles, at least as far as we could tell. And that's really great, but you can only fit so much in a car. So we were commissioned to do some larger scale stuff, do it kind of more low key, um, and that's kind of where it all started. Now special supply means a little bit of a different thing to us. We have lots of other things going on along those fronts, um, but yeah, at that time that's what it meant.
And then what happened from there?
Well, all kinds of things. Do you mean like what happened on a lot of our missions, or
Yeah,
like
like what was your? So you described kind of the day in the life of what you were doing back then, but how did it evolve then? Just driving long distances and
yeah.
did you get into war zones, or what's going on with the Russian side of things and the ethnic Russians in the eastern portions like in Donbass?
Yeah, so we definitely were driving long distances. We had centers of operations set up in Lviv, Ukraine, and Uman, which is kind of like central south Ukraine. And you know, we're taking stuff all over the place. We took stuff into Kharkiv, we took stuff into the Donbass, we took stuff to Odessa, or at least my team did. I didn't go to Odessa, but yeah. So I went out of my way to avoid going to the front, right? And there is good reason for that. I didn't want to be a guy that picked up a gun, honestly. And we also just kind of had no business up there. One of the things that we did was set up a kind of a supply line into occupied territory. Now, it wasn't us that was running stuff into occupied territory. It was locals. It was Ukrainians. This is another one of our specialties. We're able to leverage people in an area to achieve these ends, right? And so what they would do, we brought them stuff in Kharkiv, and what they would do is take it from Kharkiv through the Russian lines actually into occupied territory. There wasn't quite enough stuff at that time getting through to the civilians or even the soldiers on that side of the lines. And the deal was, as I understand it, was that Ukrainian nationals could bring stuff across for the civilians, humanitarian aid, but a portion of that would have to go to the Russians. It was usually like roughly like 30%, something like that, 30% of it, um, which I think is a pretty decent deal to be able to just drive through, because that still means that 70% is going to the civilians, right? Fair enough. And we built this thing in such a way that it could be sustained even after we were gone. When we first showed up out there, man, I mean, their warehouse was empty. It was really, really concerning. We got their supply infrastructure set up in such a way that they could keep it going, and to my knowledge, they have.
Now, were you ever? Did they ever try to recruit you, the State Department or the CIA or anything like that, trying to get you to do something for them?
Nah, I would have told them no, anyways.
Yeah.
Uh, no, no, no.
What about some of those NGOs that those sketchy NGOs that always act like they're doing humanitarian stuff, but they're actually whatever they're doing to help facilitate a nation's interest
Yeah, I'm
or
sure
war.
that we've had contact with them at some point, but we kind of have a sniff test, as I call it, to see if we want to work with someone or not. There's definitely an example of groups that we worked with that I wish we hadn't in the book. But no, as far as I know, we did not did not facilitate any of those sketchy NGOs.
What group did you regret working with, or and why?
Yeah, well, it was another group of volunteers, and there's a character in the book. I call her Girl, simply Girl, and we stole her from this other group, right? Um, I honestly just did not like these guys from the very get-go. The first conversation I had with their leader was um, concerning, to say the least. And as it turned out, yeah, he was into all kinds of sketchy stuff. He was basically just had sort of a Ponzi scheme going to fuel his operation, and he ended up once Girl came over to us, he ended up putting out a hit on me and Girl, a supposed hit. He didn't have the money to pay for it, but it was an offered 40,000 USD for both of our heads, and luckily no one took him up on it. I don't think we're
Yeah,
still here, right? But
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that would be one example, without a doubt, of people that we ended up having to work with at some point that I wish that we didn't.
Those local guys, or like someone from another country too?
No, their leader was from the UK.
Okay.
Um, Girl and this other guy, they were from the US. So they were foreign volunteers as well. And that was just, I mean, that's kind of an isolated incident, man. Most of the foreign volunteers showing up there were salt of the earth kind of people. They really just wanted to do a good thing.
And when was the last time you were over there, and do you plan to return?
I don't plan to return. I left in late August of 2022.
Okay.
I think it was the 22nd of August that I got back.
Mhm. And why,
Mhm.
why don't you plan to return anymore?
Well, you know, I don't really have a good reason other than it feels like for now my work there is done. We expect things to kind of kick off at a higher tempo this summer, so we'll see what happens. I had a sketchy encounter with the Ukrainian intelligence officer that I felt like could have been a double agent of some sort. He was much more interested in me than he was in this person I was trying to report to them, and it left a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. Like, man, I got to get out of here, right?
He
Yeah,
could have been working for the Russians or something. Yeah,
I think so.
yeah,
I think he could have been. I'm
yeah,
not I'm not gonna say with certainty, but it definitely seemed that way, you know. And when your intuition tells you something, you better listen.
yeah. So, do you feel like you were successful in your efforts and you accomplished what you wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, more or less. Of course, you leave something like that, and you always think, God, there's just more that I could do. There's more I could do. More I could have done, more I should have done, that sort of thing. Our efforts have not stopped, just to be completely clear. We still have people that are operating there. And, you know, so no, our work there is not completely done. My time in Ukraine is done, I believe. But um, yeah, if anything, we've been ramping up our efforts on this front.
And what are the efforts that you're ramping up involve? Is like the supplies, medical supplies, or
Yeah, so one of the big ideas behind my organization, Section 58, is turning every city block into a mini farm and a mini factory. So the way that wartime supply is done usually is you're bringing finished goods into an area, and that only works insofar as you can bring those finished goods in. We saw this in Mariupol. It was horrific. Um, Lots of people starved. Lots of people were dying from crazy diseases, from dirty water like cholera and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And so my partner thought, man, we better make a water filter that can be scaled and built from local supplies, right, very easily. So we partnered up with a NASA engineer to make this, and you can
Wow.
turn urine into fresh drinking water if you want to with the
Mhm.
thing. And then we thought, okay, so we've got the water. Now, what else do you need? You need, at the very basic level, clean drinking water. You need food as well, right? So we thought, okay, well, these people depend on food that's brought in, but what if they produce their own? And we've worked out a model of basically it's so basic, dude. It's like kind of a no-brainer when you think about it, but you don't see it in practice in real life. And that is growing things locally that can be transported even while they're growing. So buckets, growing stuff in buckets, that sort of thing. Building your water filters out of locally sourced materials very easily, and growing things in buckets. And that will provide your basic needs for at least a portion of people. What that does is it provides nutrition to the people there, and it also just makes it less likely that you're going to have a higher cost of human suffering, right? That's the
Mhm.
whole idea. And as of right now, we have a farm in the UK that's running this model that is proving to work both as a business and as a humanitarian effort, um, in a country where you have very strict laws and regulations. And if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. So they're running a subscription food service that brings in money, but they're also giving most of their stuff to food banks and stuff like that, while also maintaining their resources to be able to deploy out to areas that may need it whenever the
You mean
time
local food banks in the UK,
comes.
and then that, and then they're doing that in Ukraine too. Your group, or
Yes, yes, yes. We are affiliated with groups that are doing that kind of thing in the Ukraine. Now
Mhm.
they're not really running a subscription service there, but
Mhm.
they are doing this local farming.
Mhm.
Um, where you're trying to have these people produce their own stuff. That way, they're not so reliant on things being brought in, and they're not so vulnerable whenever those supply lines get taken out.
Yeah. So when you said that I think in your book you kind of it helped you understand your faith better. What was it about what you experienced that brought you closer to faith?
It's a really good question, David. Um, so wartime brings out the absolute worst in some people,
Mhm.
right? I mean, everybody knows this. It's awful, it's ugly, it's gruesome, and it's terrible. Um, But what I saw a whole lot more of was it bringing out the best in people, right? That's definitely the majority. You had a whole bunch of people that were taking up their crosses. I mean, they were picking up their crosses, and they were doing what they could for their fellow countrymen, their communities, and if they were foreign nationals. humanity, right? I sum that up to mean nothing less than God is working through those people to achieve his ends, right? Spread his glory and his goodness throughout these wicked conflicts.
Mhm.
And seeing that in real life most certainly let me know, okay, this notion of good and evil, this notion of God and the devil, it's real. And it's not just an idea that it's not some abstraction, right? It's very, very real. And this is how they work. This is how they work. They work through people.
Yeah. And what did you uh it, what was something that you learned about war that you kind of corrected what you thought about war prior to getting involved in this?
The biggest thing personally for me is that I in the past did have this notion that this weird idea that a lot of wars are good versus evil, and you can divide it up on those lines. That's mostly false. You have evil on all sides of a war. You have good on all sides of a war. It's not so clean cut. Um, that it showed me that on every side of a conflict, you're gonna have a lot of good people, a lot of good individuals, some that are trying to do the work of the Lord, no matter what is happening around them. But I also learned that in a lot of these conflicts, you don't have any good guys as far as nation states are concerned. And you could apply that to just about any war that we know about.
Mhm, mhm. So when you so when you see what's happened over there, what are lessons that you can learn, and what are some things that uh, you have to take with you for the rest of your life?
Number one is learn to laugh about things, right?
Yeah.
Number one. Um, you, if any of your listeners find themselves in a situation like that, I'm sure what they'll find is that the people around them become their families, right? And you can laugh about the worst things, you can laugh about the best things, but have a good time is
Hmm.
the number one lesson. Um, question it all though. Question it all, even the things that you're doing and the motives of the people that you might be working for.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, and that's all you can really do on an individual level anyways. It's not like any of us are in charge of the State Department. We can't control foreign policy, right? But what we can control is what we do as individuals in response to these things, and how we conduct ourselves whenever we are called upon to participate in some of these conflicts, which does happen, whether we like it or not.
What do you think about all the folks in America that kind of do well, it's not as popular anymore, but it certainly has for a while. Everybody got their little bumper stickers and their flags, and they were in solidarity with Ukraine. On one level, I guess there's a kind of innocent motive there. They just want to defend somebody who they feel was aggressed against. But on the other hand, that basic thought was obviously used by politicians to prolong the misery to the tune of billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
At every step of the turn, it appears that there's been an attempt to delay any kind of peace being made. And
Hmm.
those who have been most vocal in their claim that they care about Ukrainian people have been the most useful tools in perpetuating the delay of peace in Ukraine. How does that
Yeah.
make you feel, and as someone who was over there?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of those people, they have the best hearts, they really do. They care. They care. That's the beautiful thing about everyday Americans is they care. And they always we just have this instinct to stick up for the little guy, right? Whenever we see someone being aggressed upon, or we feel like the little guy's being pushed around, that's when we want to stand up. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. it becomes ugly when you do have these less than savory characters in DC that want to use that against us at some point. So what I would say to that is if if you do find yourself being one of these people that has a knee-jerk reaction to these things, I've been one of these in the past as well. A knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, whatever we need to do, we'll do. As soon as one of these things kicks off, I would say think twice. Think a little harder about it and look at the history of these sorts of things because we can see a real pattern. But
Yeah.
consider maybe it's not as black and white as we might want to believe.
Yeah. Um, did you suffer PTSD while you were there? Were you around a lot of horrifying things, or did you stay mostly in the positive, zone of things happening?
Well, yeah, I mean, anytime you're in a war zone, you're gonna experience pretty horrible things. I've left most of that out of the book, actually, all the
Mhm.
gruesome, gory details, because I wrote this journal. It's just a journal, and I wrote it for me so I wouldn't forget. My faculty at Texas Tech convinced me to publish it, though. And so in the book, you're not gonna find too many gory details, honestly, whether we experience them or not. Um, as far as PTSD, not too much, but I did have my concerns over there. One of them was chemical weapons. I saw that as the next logical step for the Russians to take to escalate short of nukes if they wanted to start sending that kind of stuff over there, which reasonably I knew that they wouldn't. But when you're there, you're still concerned about it. There's a very funny story I tell in the book of I'm passed out and I'm groggy and we're driving behind one of our buses. I wake up and I see fog all around us. I'm smelling the diesel exhaust, right? And I think we immediately got hit with chemical weapons, and I'm freaking out. And I'm telling all my friends, like, we gotta go, we gotta go. We're in Kiev. We're in the middle of Kiev at this time, and I'm like, we gotta get out now. And everyone just looks at me like I'm dumb, and no one says anything. And it's just a funny example of kind of how that stuff does mess with your head when you're over there. I mean, you can really let your worries get out of control, and an example of me doing that exact thing. Hmm.
In your estimation, we're told every day on television. I know you didn't really make this too political, but it's part of reality for people's considerations. Do you believe that the Russians are intending to continue to take over all of Ukraine or go into Poland or some of these other countries like we hear about, based on your experience over there?
No, I think that's a really dumb estimation, honestly. Uh, it's no offense if that's the view you hold, David, but I don't think it
No,
is.
yeah, no.
Uh, no,
We've had
there.
Colonel Douglas McGregor on too many times to get into that kind of belief.
Well,
It's very popular amongst a lot of Americans. Is
it is.
they
Yeah,
believe that that Putin is planning to expand this to eventually take other parts of Europe and not just all of Ukraine.
yeah. So I'm I am not nearly as articulate or educated as Colonel or experienced as Colonel Douglas McGregor, but I'd like to give my own estimation on it if that's okay. I do hold a master's certificate in strategic studies, so I've done a little bit of reading on this front. And the Russians' war aims, as far as I can tell, have been to slap Ukraine around a little bit to get them to stop going the NATO way and become a neutral buffer state once again. Right? I think that's been their entire war aim, and we crossed so many red lines that they finally said, okay, we have to go in. Does that make it right? No. But is that what happened? It seems to be yes. Their war aims have not been to take Ukrainian territory, dude. They don't need more territory. Um, they seem to be following a model. I think it was Clausewitz who developed this, and they're trying to degrade the Ukrainians' ability and will to resist. So they've basically made small advances across, a few miles of the Donbass, which is hailed as a big strategic defeat for the Russians. unless, of course, they're trying to trap the Ukrainians into sending all of their men and equipment into these areas where the Russians are concentrated to completely break their will and their ability to resist. And I think that's exactly what's happened. As far as them marching on into Poland, man, I don't even think they want to go across the Dnieper River in Ukraine. They will if they're put in a position where they think that they have to. Say, I don't know, you have a state like France trying to send NATO troops into Ukraine. Yeah, that might actually prompt them to keep marching on. But I don't think that's what they're trying to do. They don't need the territory. They don't really want Ukraine. They didn't even want the separatist republics. I mean, they wouldn't integrate them into Russia at first. So I have no reason to believe that unless they're pushed into a corner and their hand is forced to march into Poland, that they would. I don't think they want it. I don't think they want that.
Mhm. And you know, what do you think is going to happen with the territories that they've occupied so far? And are they using that as negotiation, or they can? Do you believe they intend to, keep those as part of Russia?
No, they've done a lot of kind of boisterous rhetoric about these areas of the Donbass that they've taken, right? And they're
Yeah.
saying, okay, these are going to be Russians now.
Hmm.
But in my estimation, is spending time in the Donbass, man, I mean, you find most of the people you're talking to would rather be a part of Russia than Ukraine. I'm just saying. So they might actually keep it if that's what the people there actually want. I think that for the Putin administration, these areas are going to be more of a bargaining chip for Ukraine. Crimea is off the table. Everybody knows this. Excuse me. But um, these other areas in the Donbass could more or less be used as a bargaining chip to try and get a better deal from Ukraine and more, maybe even more concessions. We'll give you this land back
Yeah.
if XYZ thing, right?
What about the claims from the ethnic Russians in places like the Donbass, where they say they were persecuted by the Western Ukrainian government? As you were over there as a correspondent in 2019, and I guess that was the only time you were there, right? Because you didn't get involved in the front when it was once the war kicked off, right? But 2019, you were over there. What can you say about, because we've heard, again, the fake news media says that those are all kind of like, uh, fake stories, that they weren't really persecuted, or that's been trumped up by the Russians. What's the truth from your perspective when you were over there?
From my perspective, I never saw that too much in regular life over there. I did at one point in the trenches see basically some Ukrainians blow up a bunch of separatist soldiers because they looked too comfortable. Right now, they're sitting in trenches. This is 2019. It's still a trench war. They're sitting in trenches, looking at each other through binoculars all day, every day. And these guys, maybe because I was a journalist and they wanted to put on a show,
Mm.
or maybe because there's some real malice and hatred there, decided to blow up these five guys. It was it's a really horrific thing. And of course, that happens in wartime, but there was just no good reason for it. Really, it's not like we were getting shot at. They, you know, nothing like that. Um, I have heard lots of reports, yeah, of persecutions of ethnic Russians over there. I do know that the Ukrainians would shell Donetsk city just in the middle of the city for fun all the time, just to harass them. I know that that kind of thing would happen. I know that the Russian language was banned in government institutions and schools, right? I know that
But you,
most people say again.
well, you
Go ahead.
go ahead. What you said, most people.
I know that most people that I talked to over there, you would find one of two things, one of three things. I spoke Russian, not Ukrainian, and you found a lot of people that would speak in Ukrainian to you, even though they understand you're Russian. And you found that mostly in Western Ukraine. They just refused to speak Russian. What I found in the Donbass was that most people spoke Russian and that they would call themselves Russians. They were ethnically Russian. Um, so I can't imagine that with a civil war going on, you have a dissident area of people, that there would not be some sort of persecutions of them in those areas. A small example would be in Bakhmut. There was a big battle over that in, I think, 2015. And what I saw there in 2019 was, to that day, there was Ukrainian flags painted on every light pole, right? Which you wouldn't need to do that probably if the people there thought of themselves as Ukrainians anyways. You would only need to do that if they didn't think of themselves as Ukrainians, but something else, right?
Hmm. Hmm. It in of course Bakhmut was leveled completely, right? I mean, it was pretty
Yeah.
horrific. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, what?
This
Go ahead.
this was a prediction I made um, that year. I was in an intelligence class in graduate school, and everyone was mad at me for it. But this was a prediction I made, was that Bakhmut is going to fall. It will fall. There's, yes, the Ukrainians are very dug in there. It's a fortress city. Okay, fine, but it will happen. The Russians will take it, and that about a month later ended up happening. Maybe a couple months, but yeah. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. Go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. There was a you had mentioned that they spoke Rush. You were speaking Russian in the refugee camp and near the border of Poland. Was
Mhm.
that w- so? There, that was they would only speak in Ukrainian back though. You know, I was confused how that works.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm so sorry. Let me clarify. So, whenever people would speak only in Ukrainian to you, that was a thing I found in Ukraine, both in 2019 and 2022,
Hmm.
right? You did find a lot of refugees that would refuse to speak Russian with you in 2022, for sure. Which is totally understandable. I mean, if we got invaded by Mexico, we probably wouldn't want to speak Spanish anymore, right? So like it's just a whole thing. But yeah, it, a lot of people, especially the refugees, were very graceful about this. They didn't like that I was speaking Russian, but they understand, hey, he's a dumb American. We should be happy that he's speaking in one of our languages at all,
Yeah.
and would do their best, right?
Did a lot of the Ukrainians ask you what your views were on the whole thing and why it was happening? Did they try to do loyalty tests? And, those are kind of separate topics, but
Y- Yeah, I mean, at times, I guess.
yeah.
Jason said a thing that,
Jason.
yeah, on your last
Oh,
show,
Jason Jones. Okay.
yes, he said a thing that I did have happen to me almost exactly, and it was a loyalty test, trying to suss out where my loyalties were. And um, he said a thing that I have in this book. I wrote it down in the journal at the time, and I was very, very, very explicit with everyone around me that, it's not like my loyalties lie with Ukraine. If it were Russia being invaded, I'd be in Russia helping Russians, right? And this did anger a lot of Ukrainians that I was talking to, but I find that to be pretty understandable given their circumstances.
Yeah. Do they? Is there any indication that they understand that perhaps both sides have been played here, and that there's a little bit of that this looks like people have been kind of egged on. Obviously, there have been ethnic rivalries going on there for a while, generations in some cases, having grievances about World War II and the Soviet Union and all this, but that to getting stoked into war, that perhaps that both sides have been played. Is there any awareness that's sinking in here or no?
With the Ukrainians that I know, not at all. I know I know one Ukrainian dude that he actually escaped illegally out of the country,
Yeah,
and and made his way out. As for the rest of my friends, unfortunately, no, I don't think they see it like that at all. It's when you're attacked, man. I mean, of course you're going to become radicalized. Um, I can't hold it against any of these people for having views that I might view as unreasonable because I would probably be pretty dang similar put in the same kind of situation. As far as the populace goes, man, I don't see any indication from my own personal anecdotes that these people do feel like they're getting played. Now, I would like to make a small prediction on your show, if we could call it that, and that's that I think that some sort of Western forces are going to have to end up fighting Ukrainian elements at some point because we've poured weapons into this country, into extremist groups in this country. And once our aid is gone and they lose the war, who do you think they're going to turn on?
Yeah, what yeah, tell me a little bit about what the relationship, because that's been something that I've, from your perspective, I'd like to hear your take. What is the relationship between these, I don't know what extremist groups you're referencing, but we've heard about Azov Battalion, we've heard about
Yeah.
this Thunder Battalion.
Mhm.
I don't know anything else, names offhand, but what is their relationship and to the Ukrainian government? Are they kind of just like, are they biding their, like you said, are they going to try to make a move to take control over the Western Ukrainian government, you think? And
Yes, I do. If they feel betrayed, I think that's highly likely to happen. That they're going to try to stage some sort of coup. We might even be supporting it. We'll see. I think that's more of a thing that's going to happen after the war with the Russian ends. Okay, but yeah, so Azov, I know a lot of or knew at least a lot of their guys, a lot of their former soldiers and stuff like that. And these volunteer battalions, what they were allowed to do was they could kind of just change units as they wanted. So in the Donbass battalion, who I embedded with in 2019, there were a lot of guys from the Azov battalion, right sector, all these other kind of militias that became state sanctioned organizations to fight in that civil war, right? And so my estimation, man, none of those guys were like Nazis, you know what I mean? They might have been right wing, but hey, so am I guess. And
yeah,
but I didn't hear any of them saying we gotta march on the Jews or anything like that. That would be ridiculous.
yeah.
But what I can estimate from them is that a lot of them left because the leadership elements in these like Azov and Right Sector and all that were pretty Bandera-esque Nazi types. And so
Yeah.
that's what I mean by extremist groups is these guys that might be very much inspired by Bandera and very much inclined to carry out atrocities of all kinds by any
So
means
what's
necessary.
their logic of working with the so-called, the globalist or the Western NATO project? Like how do they calculate that?
Their
Enemy by
interests
enemy?
aligned. Their interests aligned. So, yeah, there's examples of this all through history. There was like a Jewish militia in Israel that tried to partner with the Nazis at one point because their interests aligned on one issue, right? So you can see that there as well, in Ukraine, where their interests are absolutely not with the globalists. They're absolutely not with the left wing kind of agenda that we have in the UN and all this. However, the left wingers in the West are willing to give them lots of guns and training and money and all this stuff and really build up their organizations to fight the Russians who they didn't like anyways. So
So is their calculus, have they been wanting this fight, and or they just say the Russians are invaders and they're like, let's fight them? That's it.
both, I
Uh,
think, in my estimation.
and what is their strategic goal? These extremist elements, like,
I
what do they
think
want?
as far as in the Russian war goes,
Yeah, like
uh,
with this whole thing. I mean, you're saying, I mean, they can't just. I mean, are these? There's a lot of. As probably is there money in these groups? Is there? I mean, you said they've been given money, but do they have their own kind of billionaire sets, millionaire sets to kind of like create a political cause that's going to be anti, uh, you know, and would they be able to assert themselves and kind of resisting participation in EU and NATO and other types of organizations?
yeah, I think so. I can't speak too intelligently about that because it's not like I'm inside these guys' heads,
Yeah,
organizations, or anything like
yeah.
that. What I can say is they do really seem to like war in every form that they can fight it. So when the Russians come in, they're going to fight the Russians. When the Russians leave, they're probably going to fight the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
They were fighting Ukrainians before that in the Donbass. That's why
Hmm.
they were formed. Um,
Who by they are you talking about the leaders mostly or the guys doing the killing?
the leaders
Yeah.
mostly. Now, the guys doing the killing will end up eventually being the leaders of these things. So we
Are there a lot of young folks still on these battalions, or is it, I've heard about a lot of these older people being recruited, like 50-year-olds and so forth, 60-year-olds being sent to the front line.
Yeah, I don't know about now, to be honest with you. When I was there, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of like middle-aged dudes out there. You had a lot of young guys in their 20s, but the majority of guys were like in their 40s and maybe even 50s.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really something.
What do
Uh,
you think of? Go ahead.
no, sir, after you.
I wanted to ask you about the journalist Gonzalo Lopez. Can you talk a little bit about Gonzalo Lira? Here, this is a guy who was a journalist. He was over there in Kharkiv, and he was apparently died in prison. Was he killed, or what was the story here?
To
Died of
be honest,
pneumonia.
I'm not familiar with this gentleman. Was he the New York Times guy, or
He was
was
he was this is a just I pulled it up on Wikipedia. He was a Chilean American novelist. He was a filmmaker, commentator, self-styled dating coach. He was involved in the manosphere. He was posting anti-feminist content under the name Coach Red Pill, and he was a resident of Kharkiv. He vlogged about the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. He was accused of spreading Russian disinformation and propaganda, and then he was arrested again and died of pneumonia in custody on January 12th, 2024.
oh wow, he was arrested by the Ukrainians then, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is
Detained by the
definitely,
Secret Service of Ukraine.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this gentleman, but I can imagine that his experience is not isolated. There's very tight control now over the media in Ukraine, and there's been many, to my knowledge, many kind of dissident journalists be arrested, and they can do it legally, not only because it's just a corrupt country, but because they're at war and they have every excuse to. So I can imagine that this is not the only guy that this has happened to.
Man, it's got to be uh, pretty.
It's rough, man. It's a
Rough.
dangerous job. War
Yeah,
correspondence is not easy. It's not safe. Um, it's not a job that I want to do anymore, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
Um, yeah, so really big respect for those guys that do it for sure.
yeah. What you said that you had an encounter where you asked God for a sign. Could you tell us about that and how you came to be, or how did that work?
I did. Um, so this sign that I got was on May 29th, 2021. And I was staying out in my camper van out in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, and I had really been wrestling with the idea of God and what God was. I never doubted his existence. I never doubted the existence of an evil force either. But my big question I had that night was basically the legitimacy of the Christian God. And if that's not the way, well, what is? I was very frustrated that there seems to be all these differences between religions, and who's to say that I don't know, the Buddhists didn't get it right? Who's to say that the Muslims didn't get it right or whatever, right? And from my perspective, also at that time, being a typical millennial, um, I thought that religion was used as a way to just kind of an excuse for bad behavior like wars, persecution, all this stuff. And so given that pretext, man, I mean, I'm wandering through the woods in Oklahoma. I'm like, I have a pistol in one hand and a bottle of Jim Beam in the other, and I'm angrily shaking my fist at God. And I'm like, God, I know you're there, but what are you? And how do I know which religion to follow because I want to follow one.
Yeah.
Give me the true one. And my answers are not satisfied. I'm walking back to my van. I stop on this bridge going across a pond um, because there was a voice in my head that just said, stop and wait. Right. I do that. And I see a cloud moving in front of the moon. It stops on the moon. And I'm given this sign.
Yeah.
So you can see the cross in the water that it made. You can see a light that stayed there. I have 3 pictures of this. This light stayed there the entire time. Um,
Is that with flash or no flash? Or
this is no flash. This
yeah.
is just it's completely dark out. The only light is the moon.
Yeah.
And I'm given a cross in the water. And at that moment I knew, okay, so Christianity is obviously, how could you see that and not think
Yeah.
Christianity? When I got the understanding that, okay, we're done, move on, the cloud moved. I kid you not, as soon as I took a step, the cloud moved out of the way.
Oh,
Well, um, I had had a hard time connecting with any sort of church or tradition after that, even though I was trying. And it
mhm,
wasn't until in August 2022, I'm on my way home from Ukraine. I'm stopped
mhm,
over at my buddy's house in Poland. He's a Polish Catholic guy. And I tell him this story and I show him that picture without hesitation. He says, "Oh, that's the burning heart of Jesus." I'm like, what is the burning heart of Jesus? What is that?
mhm,
It says, oh, it's a Catholic thing. They had just left it at that.
mhm,
And deep down in my soul, man, I knew that I needed to be a Catholic. Um, I just didn't know how. I wasn't ready to accept that. I was very anti-Catholic, actually, and God started working in my life from that moment on for the
mhm,
next year until I finally decided to go full send and just I really got to try this whole Catholic thing out. I really have to. Um, since then, nothing has been the same. And
mhm.
I also now, I'll happy to report, David, that I know what the burning heart of Jesus is, right? So it's really just it's my own small anecdote. Your listeners can buy it or not, but that is my story of conversion and faith.
Yeah, that's a great story, and I think you've experienced the reality of war, and I think you've done a great deal of effort to try to help people in that midst of it, and I hope that there's some way to be able to in other words, what I'm trying to say is that there's a tremendous amount of inertia for media which promotes conflict and murder and sacrificial violence. And the question remains: will the public ever have the appetite to consume the truth,
Mhm.
right, and to be able to understand the reality of war and murder and the ways in which they're participants of these things, and I think that the role of media is to mediate the truth in a similar sense as a priestly mediator to mediate the truth between you know what 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 heaven is like and what earth is acting like, and mediate that the difference there, and that
Yeah.
means the end of sacrifice.
Mhm.
The end of sacrifice is something that the Christian revelation reveals. um, and of course, Christ gives himself up as a self-sacrifice, a sacrifice which is a different term for sacrifice than the sacrifice of another, right? And war is mediated based on sacrifice of another, and it remains
One
to
of
be
my
seen.
one of my favorite things I've ever heard you say, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I got
Mhm.
to tell you this. One of my favorite things I've ever heard you say is that the media will use these wars and use sacrificial lamb theology basically to try and get people to buy in on it. They
Mhm.
play on people's good sentiments and our tradition in the West of
Mhm.
following some sort of Christian values
Mhm.
that really values self-sacrifice to promote the glory of God,
Mhm.
right? And that's how they take a good thing and turn it into bad. and they use
Mhm.
it for bad ends, right? That's my own story here is it does not make me look good by any stretch of the imagination. It's full of debauchery and just stuff, to be honest, I'm very ashamed of. But what you can see is the people that are around me, God working through them and their sacrifice to hopefully bring about the ultimate triumph of Jesus at some point, at least in this conflict.
Yeah. And there's a realization that has to sink in at some point about the what I consider to be the anthropological dimensions of the gospel, which puts our focus on the human ethical obligations of encountering the gospel. And
Hmm.
there's too much. I talk about this a lot. That there's too much disembodied theological only talking about God. And when you
Yeah,
do that, it's always easy to sell war with God like that because there's no embodied incarnational. Wait a second, this is an atrocity. It doesn't matter. You can always, a disembodied Jesus can be easily used as a vehicle for selling another war or, or justifying an atrocity, justifying war sacrifice. And, like you said, it's true that they're predating on people's ability to be concerned about the victim, and they can't sell war like they used to. You didn't have to present your side as a victim in order to gain currency for a war campaign
right.
for Christ. This is a novel thing, and I wish to God that the American people, particularly because they're the ones who are the tax cow, the cow that's being milked by this entire global war effort all around the world. Not that other countries don't have wars, but we're the biggest, our economy and our culture is based on war, unfortunately. And it's
Right.
sad because you have, the psychopaths have used Christians' concern for the victim, but they have weaponized their ignorance to such a breathtaking degree um, that to wake up to the decades of atrocities that have been done in the name of defending slain lambs is going to be a level of repentance. I don't think people can fully count. I don't think they can fully prepare for that. I don't know. Only the grace of God. That's probably why they're not waking up yet. But I mean, things are changing. We see what's going on, even in Israel for the first time. Republicans are slightly starting to not be interested in starting or continuing a war for the first time in Israel. This is like this is the greatest miracles. I'm sure there's a prophecy in the Bible we can find that points to, my God, Republicans stop caring about perpetuating a war in Israel. This is prophesied in Ezekiel that people would discover Christ. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is kind of prophesied there.
Yeah. I think now you're David, your listeners are not simple-minded people with the exception of me. I definitely am. So what just a very simple way to just add on to what you everything you just said, which I feel like is absolutely correct, is
Mhm.
as Christians, we are not under any circumstances allowed to perpetrate evil in the name of good. And that simple principle
Mhm.
will help us prevent these things from happening in the future. We're not allowed to perpetuate evil in the name of good. It is strictly forbidden. So think twice.
Mhm. Do
Yeah.
you do you believe that the ambitions of these war makers can be neutered by the advancement of technologies that alleviates our dependence on their systems of power?
No, not necessarily
Yeah.
because and it depends on specifically what you mean by that, but for the most part, it seems like the more technological advancements there are, the tighter their grip on us kids.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we found some space to rebel using the internet,
Hmm.
right? But there's no guarantee that that's going to stick around. There's also no guarantee that it's having the effect that we would like it to, right? Although I think the tides are turning for sure. But as far as advancements go, I don't know. It's hard to say. Robots are scary, right?
Yeah. I just mean like if we could have energy without requiring their oligarch based grid, that would help with these conflicts always about war. I mean, I think about why we're always told we have to be in the Middle East, for example, because of we need to have a we need to have a footprint over there to make sure the energy systems are nice and smooth, the oil is flowing nice and smooth under our dollar denomination. But if you don't need oil, period, for for the purposes of transportation and a whole host of things, I mean, that opens up an opportunity for, moving beyond. It's kind of like, if you're held up by a medieval troll gang that's
Yeah.
like controlling your bridge and you can't get out of your community.
Yeah.
And if somebody can invent a plane or whatever, you can just kind of fly over that bridge and get on with your
Right.
life.
Right. Yeah. So that would be really great if we got our energy situation figured out. I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, you work in oil. You could give me some information about that probably maybe another time.
Yeah, maybe I could. I mean, it's just very simple. Everything is energy.
Yeah.
Energy is everything. Energy is the economy that people worship.
Mhm.
Energy is our entire existence here in the
Yeah.
modern Western world. Um, so let's say there's an expansion of the green revolution, right? More renewables, more solar, more winds, more battery powered cars. That kind of thing, especially the electric cars, man. I mean, that will be used against us. That is absolutely part of the plan.
Mm.
Um, I think the kind of free energy that you're talking about, though, is it nuclear or is it
Yeah, there's
the
different things. Yeah. Yeah.
energy? Yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah. If we could get our energy nailed down, that would be really great. We need to be cognizant of well, who's going to implement these projects. Um, Say we get our free energy and it is the oligarchs that are implementing it. I mean, that is the function of elites in society, right? Is they do create the factories that give us jobs, right? I think that a lot of this could start with a concept that Jordan Peterson very much brings to the table, which is we need to hold our elites to a higher standard. It's
Mhm.
hard to be a libertarian when you're talking about an elite. When you're given such a privileged and blessed position, you are expected to behave accordingly to that much higher of a standard. I think much of it has to start there because those are the people that are going to be funding and implementing these free energy projects, whether we like it or not. I'd love to see it crowdsourced. I think that would be the best way to do it, and I think that is possible. But realistically, is that the way we go about it? I'm not entirely sure. So we love grassroots stuff, but we need grassroots for the upper crust as well.
Yeah.
Roots movement to correct.
Yeah, there's a problem people notice on the right, that the people who have money on the right, they're always so obsessed with getting an ROI, like
Yeah,
giving your 5 year plan, whereas the people like on the left, the billionaires there, they don't care about the ROI. They're truly committed to a cause, a revolutionary cause, and they're throwing money. It's just like
yeah,
George Soros. He's buying up all these radio stations right now because he knows that, this is a medium that will be very effective for certain communities for decades to come, and it's a great opportunity to control the information
right.
distribution. And right wing people don't think about that. They think, give me my 5 year plan to get a ROI. Very very transactional thinking, not thinking in a systemic way that looks at the big picture and really truly committed to a cause. And it's because I think that unfortunately, Christianity is something that is incompatible with a reactionary state of mind.
Mhm.
Christianity is always outpacing whatever we can come up with in our minds. In that sense, it's a left wing thing. It's not left wing, but it feels like that in the sense that Christianity is always outpacing us.
Mhm.
It's a future. It's the religion of the future, right? It's the religion that created the concept of a future. It's a religion that created the concept of history
Yeah.
as a vocation, and to be able to you can't capture the essence of a cultural Christianity if you're doing so in a reactive way, because Christianity doesn't react. It sets the
No,
pace. It sets the
yeah,
pace.
it does. I mean, a lot of people sum up the success of the West to germs, guns, and steel, and I completely disagree. Those things helped, but really, we should not find it to be such a coincidence that the most Christian countries are the ones that not only conquered large parts of the world and colonized it, but brought the greatest prosperity ever known
Mhm.
to man in those areas. That
Mhm.
is no
Yeah.
coincidence at all. And Christianity absolutely does outpace everything else. This is kind of one of the problem with your right wingers that kind of they hoard their money like dragons and are not committed to any cause. It's because that money is their god. We
Right.
need to rethink that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There's the Bible begins in a garden and ends in a city. So that means something must be built through
Right.
through his body on earth as it is in
Mhm.
heaven. So heaven is coming to earth, and it's Romans 8 says that creation is groaning for the it is waiting in anticipation um for the sons of God to basically step up and do what they're supposed to do to basically break the bondage that creation has towards decay,
Yeah.
right? Decay represents civilizational structures that result in wars like you just experienced and like people were experiencing. That's a decay based system that,
Yeah.
and Christianity is the place where the free thinker should be. And unfortunately, until people can understand that there's a kind of harmonization that takes place with the progressive and the conservative and traditional that kind of get harmonized when
Mhm.
you're really truly Christian and imitating Christ. Everybody wants to pick one or the other, and that's the whole disaster. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the whole disaster as well. Okay, if we're going to go do progress, that means we throw out all traditional standards of no. I mean, come on, how did you get that? How did
Right.
you
Yeah.
get that? How come we can't have cures for cancer, anti-gravity, and treating children with innocence and treating having decency and dignity? Those things are not mutually incompatible at all. In fact, they're essential for one another to happen.
Yeah. They
So
are.
yeah,
They
it's
are.
fascinating.
And what I'll say to your listeners, David, is again, I'm a little bit of a simpleton, so I can't put things quite so elegantly as you do. But um, men, Christian men, are not called to be weak, and they are not called to be inactive. In fact, that's really the only group in the Bible that Jesus has such contempt for is weak men.
Yeah,
Don't allow yourself to be a weak man,
yeah,
an active one.
very good. Can you show us the title again one more time?
Sir,
Yeah. So that's The Volunteers' War by Ryan Miller. I really appreciate your time, man. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm glad that you were able to share those thoughts with us today. Thank you.
oh man, yeah, David, thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor to be on your show.
Well, same here. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege. So, if do you have a website or anything else if people want to stay in touch with you, or just
I
what's the
don't
best way?
have I don't have a website, sir, but I do have an email.
Okay,
And if you're okay with it, I'd like to share that with your viewers.
sure. Go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So it's going to be ryan.miller.section58@gmail.com. I'll show it to you on the screen here.
Yeah, yeah. There we go.
ryan.miller.section58@gmail.com. Hit me up for anything y'all want. I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.